In this lesson, we're exploring the question, how did Napoleon's reign reflect Enlightenment ideals? So we'll continue our study of the French Revolution, looking at how it ends with the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Our goal today is to learn about Napoleon's rule. And in order to do that, we first will have to describe how Napoleon becomes an absolute ruler of France. We'll also need to be able to explain how Napoleon's rule reflected Enlightenment ideals. And then finally, we'll need to identify the reasons why European powers were able to finally defeat his empire. Now let's look at the words that we're going to find throughout this lesson. So take a moment to review these words. At any time during the lesson, if you need a refresher, just click on the word and you can get a little more context to it. So the question we're answering in this lesson, how did Napoleon's reign reflect Enlightenment ideals, allows us to start off by looking at Napoleon's rise to power first. Once we look at how he kind of develops this power, we're going to have a chance to look at Napoleon in power. Particularly, we're going to have a chance to examine how his reign reflected the Enlightenment in some ways, and how it didn't reflect the Enlightenment in other ways. And then finally, we're going to finish up by looking at Napoleon's defeat. Now let's take a moment to look at how the people of France viewed Napoleon. Before we discuss Napoleon's rise to power, let's review very quickly the events leading up to his reign. First, we know that the French Revolution begins with this hope of creating an equal society. And the National Assembly that breaks off as this independent new government is trying to, at first, maybe even create a constitutional monarchy like we see in Britain, but the result of the more radical wing of the new government, the Jacobins, they want to create this complete kind of representative democracy. And so this new kind of radical government institutes something called, that we call the Reign of Terror, which was this period where the Committee of Public Safety executed 17,000 French people that were seen as counter-revolutionaries. Now, following this one-year reign of terror, the French government is kind of wants to move on. And as a result, they create a new government called the Directory, and they appoint 5 directors of the Directory. Now, this is going to directly lead into Napoleon's rise to power, which we'll talk about next. So we've had a chance to review what was happening leading up to Napoleon's reign. And we're trying to answer this question, how did Napoleon's reign reflect Enlightenment ideals? So the first thing we'll need to do is understand his rise to power. Now, although Napoleon would eventually become the Emperor of France, he begins his career as an ordinary soldier. He fights in those wars with Austria and Prussia, in which the Austrian and Prussian monarchs were trying to reestablish the French monarchy in the hopes of diffusing talk of revolution in their own countries. And now, as an ordinary soldier, he's able to start making connections with important leaders, and ultimately he puts himself in a position to be considered one of the best military leaders in history. Now, Napoleon is inspired by some of those Enlightenment ideas. The thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau are inspiring him to believe in what the revolution stands for, although he's not quite sure of which form of new government France should take immediately. Eventually, he joins the Jacobins, that very radical wing of the new French government. And because of the connections that he was able to make early on in his military career, and because he was able to step up to defend the Directory from an angry mob, he's ultimately appointed commander of the French army. Now, after he starts winning many victories as the commander, he's then put into power as the commander-in-chief. And despite the fact that he was an average soldier, he ends up being really extraordinary in this new role as commander-in-chief. So we'll look at how he establishes this power. Now, Napoleon had been fighting in these wars outside of France. When he returns, he finds that the royalists, those more conservative members of the new French government that supported a constitutional monarchy originally, they're starting to gain more power. And so he forces the Directory to resign in something called a coup d'etat, a forcible removal of government. Now, he forms a new government, a military dictatorship, in which he uses those Enlightenment ideals of government not protecting the rights of the people as an opportunity to overthrow that government. And in the new military dictatorship that he establishes, he signs peace treaties with those European powers that were looking to reestablish the French monarchy. And so now he's put himself in position to be the most powerful man in France. And you see in this painting on the screen, before we move on, we'll look at this painting where we see Napoleon right here taking control, taking this power. So now let's move on to look at how he becomes this really powerful force. Now, he establishes something called the consulate. And the consulate is made up of 3 councils. Napoleon himself is the first council. Now he says, "People of France, swear with us to be true to the Republic, one and indivisible, founded on equality, liberty, and the representative system." So again, he's using some of these Enlightenment ideals, particularly in establishing a representative system, but in action, in reality, he's really establishing a military dictatorship. And so as we look at Napoleon's new government, it's important to kind of keep in mind that while he's saying he's supporting these Enlightenment ideals, his actions are really speaking something else. Now, the first consul, which Napoleon himself is represented by, he presents France with a new constitution. In this new constitution, Napoleon is given complete control of all parts of government. Now, this is submitted to a vote by the people to either accept or reject it, and it wins by a large majority. And this is because he has the support of the French people and soldiers because of his unyielding charisma. So eventually Napoleon's going to find himself reshaping France, and that's what we'll look at next. In this lesson, we're exploring the question, how did Napoleon's reign reflect Enlightenment ideals? And we know that in rising to power, Napoleon uses that key Enlightenment ideal of overthrowing a government that is not protecting the rights of the people. And he uses something called a coup d'etat, forcible removal of government, to establish himself as the first consul in a new military dictatorship. Now let's move on to look at how Napoleon governs. As the new commander-in-chief, Napoleon hoped to establish long-lasting reforms in France. And so some of the things he did to reform the French government was establish a new bank, a Bank of France, where improved tax collection measures were taken. This is going to lead to, finally, a stabilized economy in France. He also dismisses corrupt officials, so he's trying to kind of clean out the government and stabilize it from within. And then finally, he's expanding educational opportunities. Now, previously, higher education, secondary education like high school, university education was really only limited to the wealthy. These new educational opportunities are going to expand educational opportunities to middle-class people as well. Now let's take a look at what Napoleon does with religion and government. Now, he ultimately is going to help restore the Catholic Church in France. He establishes a relationship for the first time since the revolution began with the Pope. And in the image on the screen here, we see the new Pope at the time, Pope Pius VII. He also tries to reestablish Catholicism as the official religion of France. And he gives himself the power to nominate bishops. So again, we see that he's kind of overreaching this absolute power that he takes. Finally, he's going to provide church leaders with salaries. Now, he also establishes something called the Napoleonic Code. So let's take a moment to look at what that was. The Napoleonic Code was a comprehensive set of laws. Now, this meant that the laws were enforced throughout France. And in some ways, the Napoleonic Code reflected these Enlightenment ideals that Napoleon said that he believed so much in. So they protect many of those civil liberties, those natural rights that the Enlightenment talks so much about, like equality before the law, freedom of religion, and the protection of private property. So this is protecting those civil liberties. But in other ways, liberties were limited, such as the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, and women's freedoms and their place in society. Now let's take a look at what we've learned so far to review. In 1802, the people of France decided to keep Napoleon in power. And as a result, he was named the first consul for life, and he was given the right to choose his own successor. Now, he's ultimately crowned Emperor of France in 1804, and he wants a huge coronation ceremony. And just as the Pope is about to crown him the emperor, he takes the crown from the Pope and places it on his own head. And that really kind of symbolizes how Napoleon sees himself. He is in this role of ultimate power to do anything he wants. Now, in the painting we see Napoleon, who's already crowned. You can kind of see him here. He's now crowning his wife, Josephine, as the empress. Now, this is going to set the stage for Napoleon ruling as an absolute monarch. But because he really believes strongly in some Enlightenment ideals, it might be fitting to call him an enlightened monarch. So we're answering this question, how did Napoleon's reign reflect Enlightenment ideals? We know that in rising to power, Napoleon uses some of these Enlightenment ideals to create a coup d'etat to take over the French government. And we know that once he establishes himself as the commander-in-chief, he soon finds himself in this position as emperor, as what we might call an enlightened monarch. Now we're going to move on to take a look at how the expansion of the French Empire ultimately leads to Napoleon's defeat. So what's Napoleon going to do once he crowns himself emperor? Well, he's going to build an empire. And what we're looking at here is a map detailing the French Empire as it was by the year 1812. But if you notice our key, it shows us that France actually grew considerably in a pretty short period of time. Right after Napoleon becomes emperor in 1799, and you can see it's kind of this lighter shade of lavender here, we can see the boundaries of the French Empire are really limited to the boundaries of what France are today. But look what's happening. By 1812, just a little over a decade later, the boundaries of the empire have grown considerably. So you can see the kind of slightly darker shade of lavender shows us which areas had been added to Napoleon's empire by 1812. So you can see kind of going into Central Europe, Italy, even part of what we now would call Poland. And then you can even see that the alliances that Napoleon had gained included the Austrian Empire, Prussia, parts of Scandinavia as well. And so Napoleon was really, growing this empire by annexing and invading these different regions and persuading leaders of other areas to ally with him. But England, or Britain, is afraid of what this could potentially mean for them. And so Britain actually persuades other countries to try to push back against Napoleon's growing empire. So let's take a look at what happens. Now, we see again the French Empire as it was in 1812. And so we're looking at kind of a smaller version of what we just looked at. But there are a couple other things that are noted here. And we'll talk about some of these things in detail. So a couple of these battles are key points in which Napoleon's empire is really going to be challenged. And remember, the British found Napoleon a particular threat. And so they're going to kind of face him head to head here in Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar. So we can kind of point out the Iberian Peninsula, and I don't want to cross out Battle of Trafalgar, but this area here, what we call Spain, is actually also known as the Iberian Peninsula, and this is going to be really a key point in Napoleon's empire's growth, because what he initially does is actually invade Spain. He places his brother at the helm to be in charge there, but it's actually going to be a coalition of Spanish and Portuguese and British forces that push back against Napoleon, and ultimately he's defeated here in 1805. Now, he's going to try to kind of use the Spanish fleet to work to his benefit, but later on in the Peninsular War in 1813, it's going to be this British Navy that's led by the great General Horatio Nelson that's able to completely overcome the Franco-Spanish Navy and really kind of put Napoleon's greater ambitions to rest. But believe it or not, this is not going to be the worst of Napoleon's defeats, and we'll talk more about what ultimately leads to his demise in just a bit. Now, in the summer of 1812, Napoleon decides to invade Russia in order to confront the Russian ruler Alexander I, who was refusing to honor his alliance, or supposed alliance, with France. And so when he invades Russia that summer, he's got 600,000 French troops. Now, the Russian leaders make an interesting decision. They decide to retreat rather than fight. And as a result, they leave most of the places that Napoleon was invading completely without not only troops to fight, but also without any supplies. Now, by the time Napoleon finds himself in Russia, it's getting closer and closer to winter. And so eventually, Napoleon finds himself losing most of his troops to weather, disease, and desertion. Now, you can see in this painting what Napoleon's eventual defeat looks like, because you can see the evidence of the really bad weather, all the snow on the ground, and you can see the fallen horses and soldiers as well. Now, ultimately, this invasion is considered kind of a complete failure for obvious reasons, as we can see in the painting, but also because Napoleon finds himself with fewer than 10,000 troops by the end of this winter. So you can see a significant loss in the amount of support that he had. As well, when he arrived in Moscow to confront Alexander I, it had been mostly abandoned. Now, the retreat that Napoleon finds himself having to endure out of Russia is going to be a big turning point in his rule, because this is going to inspire other countries in Europe to fight back against him. And at this point, we start to see Napoleon's downfall. We've got countries in Europe allying against Napoleon. So you've got Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, all working together in the hopes of defeating Napoleon. And by this point, France has found itself at war pretty much constantly for about 2 decades. So these constant wars are exhausting the French resources. They don't have as much manpower, as many supplies. They're constantly in debt. And as a result, their morale is really low. The French government by this point also wants to see Napoleon out of office. And so they actually begin to start surrendering to these different countries that are fighting against France. Eventually, Napoleon is exiled, or he's sent away from France to the island of Elba. Now, the big idea here is to understand that Napoleon really believed that he was spreading Enlightenment ideals. He did not understand why the people of Europe would want to go backwards, back to an absolute system of rule. Despite the fact that he ends up ruling as a dictator and very similarly to an absolute ruler, there are many ways that he did support Enlightenment ideals: freedom of religion, the freedom of people to be as successful as they can be, out of hard work, not based on their social class or their station. And ultimately, Napoleon isn't going to let himself kind of go down without a fight. Despite the fact that he's exiled, he has a plan to escape, and we'll take a look at that next. Despite his initial exile to the island of Elba, Napoleon escapes. And soon after his escape and return to France, he's reinstated as emperor in 1815. But this is going to be pretty short-lived. He's only going to be emperor again for 100 days. Shortly after he's reinstated, war resumes, and ultimately he's defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. And this proves to be the official end of Napoleon's reign, because shortly after this battle, he's exiled once again, this time to St. Helena, and that's where he dies 6 years later. Now, following the Napoleonic Wars, we see that the Congress of Vienna comes together, a peace conference that's led by Prince Metternich of Austria, with the hopes of reestablishing that balance of power that existed in Europe pre-French Revolution. And we see that as a result, most of Europe's monarchies were restored, despite the fact that they're trying to create this balance of power. Two countries in particular, Britain and Prussia, emerge as kind of the most powerful. Now, the Congress of Vienna, by all accounts, was the end of the French Revolution. Now, most of these monarchies at this point see those ideas of the Enlightenment and the Revolution as failures. But that revolutionary spirit still existed throughout Europe, and as a result, it kind of segues into a new type of political identity, something called nationalism, extreme pride in one's home country. So let's take a look at the effects of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna and just make sure that we understand kind of all of the big events that came out of those. So we'll take a look at a timeline of events to get an understanding of how Napoleon's rule started and finished. We know that in 1799, Napoleon comes into power. Now, this is just about a decade after the French Revolution begins. And so his power is meant to kind of settle all of the chaos that endured over that decade. Now, Napoleon rules France for about 15 years, from 1799 to 1814. And in that time, he issues the Napoleonic Code, and he tries and fails to invade Russia. Now, shortly after that failed invasion in Russia, Napoleon finds himself exiled for a short period. He escapes exile, is reinstated as emperor, but shortly thereafter he's defeated in the battle at Waterloo. Now, at that point, he's exiled again, and 6 years later, he dies in St. Helena.